Welcome to this live Q&A session. I'm Dominic Waghorn, Sky's International Affairs Editor, and today we're discussing a joint investigation by Sky News and Lighthouse Reports, which have uncovered gruesome details of a massacre which took place on the 3rd of June in 2023 in Kutum, a town in North Darfur. And I'm glad to say we have Sky News Africa correspondent Yousra Elbagir, who has brought this very disturbing report to us. And we're going to talk through some of the issues and how the report was compiled, what it was like compiling it. And we've got a whole lot of questions that you have sent in and will send in over the next half hour or so. And this is one of many episodes of ethnically motivated atrocities in the latest war in Sudan, a war that has, I think, grabbed the attention of many people. But Yousra, welcome and thanks for this, because it is a very powerful piece of journalism, and it shines a light on something I think that most people, it's kind of fallen off the radar for a lot of people, and we certainly haven't seen what's happening in Darfur at all so far. We were aware of it 20 years ago, but not in the last few months or year or so. So, I mean, I think it is a complicated war. Try and explain to people how we've got to this and who's killing who and why are they doing this in particular that you've uncovered in Darfur.
Yeah, so I think the best thing to do is to go back to the 2019 revolution, because that was a seminal moment for Sudan. And it was a moment where the population kind of reintroduced themselves to the world. There were images of amazingly brave young people leading the charge against a 30-year dictator, Omar al-Bashir, who'd sold the country for parts for decades. The revolution was this democratization of the public space. It was people saying, we've had enough, we want ownership of our country, and we're sick of the military. We want civilian rule. That was the slogan, even after Omar al-Bashir was ousted in April 2019. But that power vacuum was quickly filled with these two commanders. One was the Inspector General, turned head of the army, Abdel Fattah Burhan, and the other was Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo Hemeti, is his, what people know him as, and he was the head of the RSF. RSF is this militia born out of the Janjaweed militias that rose to prominence in the early 2000s in the genocide that you mentioned. And what happened over the 2 decades was this militia kind of grew in prominence, kind of behind the scenes. He wasn't one of the Janjaweed leaders that was being condemned with al-Bashir, who was mentioned in ICC reports. He was kind of in the background. So he was building his power base very quietly. And when the revolution started, he positioned himself, he was Bashir's favorite henchman, essentially, told him, hey, we can protect you. So his militia, which was mostly kind of relegated to Darfur, other regions, and worked as a border guard, slowly gained legitimacy, became known as the Rapid Support Forces, and then saw this opportunity in the capital, saw that al-Bashir was feeling very weak, told him, bring us in, we'll protect you, entered Khartoum, essentially. Then ousted him, and what we had was suddenly an army chief and a head of a militia leading the transition period post-revolution. When the time came for them to hand over to civilian governance, as agreed in a power-sharing agreement document, they held a coup, October 25th, 2021. Then the cracks in their partnership started to deepen. They both wanted sole power. It was there for the taking. The army wanted the RSF to become a part of the armed forces, and Hemeti wasn't going to give up his very lucrative family business in this militia to become absorbed into the security state that he'd benefited from for many years. And April 15th, 2023, last year, it just on a Saturday morning, as it does, just erupted in the capital. And this is not just a random city. This is the biggest city in the Sahel, 7 million people at least, a sprawling capital, on the Nile, where the Niles meet. And just in a moment, it became this protracted 1.5 years of war.
So it was a people power revolution that I think caught the imagination of millions around the world. And as you say, it then descended into this power struggle and this devastating civil war that you have, reported on very compellingly and courageously, I have to say. And now you've sort of found this I think, untold story in the sort of darkest corner of this war. Tell us how you found the story and what was it like telling the story, and was it dangerous? Was it difficult to tell? How did you find it, first of all?
So Lighthouse Reports approached us with this footage, and we'd covered ethnic violence that followed this massacre. We were on the border with West Darfur last year, a couple of months into the war, and people were just flooding Adre, the border town, with bullet holes, telling us that they were being killed just on the basis of ethnicity, kind of all around the state. We were seeing the aftermath, but then, a year later, in May of this year, being shown kind of videos of what this looked like systemically, what people were doing. I was shocked. I still was shocked, even though I'd seen people with bullets in them. I still was shocked to see people cheering over lifeless bodies. And, we worked on trying to find out who the civilians were. If they were civilians, we had to kind of figure out who they were that were being killed. And then this picture that was being painted of these 5 brothers in the room in their house, hiding, their mum being the only, guardian there, them being dragged out in a hunt for civilian men and shot in broad daylight. To kind of just create that kind of backdrop to this footage, it makes it all the more harrowing to understand that this isn't just, a byproduct of conflict. This is a targeted assault on a community on the basis of their ethnic origin and on their skin tone, because that's how they find them and choose them. And it's happening 20 years after genocide was essentially declared and meant to be dealt with. So it was quite, it was an eye-opening experience. And then going to Chad, we'd been to Chad twice, but to go back, having seen what we'd seen in those videos and meeting survivors of that massacre, I think it definitely, firstly, kind of to have an isolated incident and know that these camps are full of people fleeing all sorts of atrocities, but then being able to hone in on a single day and see what people are going through in 24 hours. And the fact that their town is still being held by the RSF, that's still captured. It was one of the first garrisons to fall, the second in the region, and the third after Khartoum. And now this is their modus operandi, and they've continued with impunity. So to be able to show this isn't just what happened on that day. This is what happens when you don't intervene. This is the blueprint.
And when the world doesn't seem to care, because, compared to what happened 20 years ago when the Darfur genocide did generate, outrage around the world, celebrities were talking about it. It caught the world's attention. To draw on a couple of questions, let's ask you, on that point. One person's whose handle is SKM94 saying, why are there no international arrest warrants for those involved in the atrocities in Sudan? And also, why is the ICC not described this as a genocide? Do you think it's a genocide? And if it is, why is the world not calling it that?
The experts we've spoken to have just stopped short of calling it a genocide because they, rightfully so, say the International Criminal Court needs to make that designation. What we've seen is that these processes are very drawn out, right? We've seen that cases around genocide, it takes a long time for the evidence to be assessed. Just while we were working on this report, the ICC put out a call for submissions around violence in Sudan and in Darfur specifically. And that's obviously quite, it inspires hope. But by the time there is something tangible, people will have died en masse. Just to give you context, in 2003, the conflict broke out. 2004, the US designated Darfur as a genocide. 2010, the ICC issued arrest warrants for Elbagir. It takes ages. It takes, a very long time. Elbagir hasn't been handed in. He was just kind of sequestered away to a cell in the political prison that he'd put political prisoners in after the revolution, that's known to have marble floors and is very cushy,
Right.
And then he was taken to a hospital because he's elderly and sick, and the hospital was a military hospital where the general manager used to be his private doctor when he was president. So Elbagir, these guys who ousted him, following a popular uprising, always kind of made sure that he was okay, that he wouldn't be extradited. They were complicit. They are complicit in the crimes that he's being indicted for. So you can only imagine what kind of threats he's making to them about what he'll say if he is in an international court. So the fact that Hemeti was never really isolated as a militia leader, I think is the result. This is the result of him being kind of overlooked. He fell through the cracks, essentially. Right. Musa Hilal, one of the other Janjaweed leaders, was isolated by human rights groups, mentioned in court proceedings that he was his guy on the ground. But Hemeti was documented as one of the Janjaweed militia leaders, and he just got away with it. And this is the result.
And I guess that track record of impunity and the fact that the cogs of international justice do grind very, very slowly and often very ineffectively is not a great deterrent, is it, for people like Hemeti and others, to stop them doing what they're doing. Let's just ask you what Neville is asking here. He says, heartbreaking report, Yousra, you've reported on today. It's very disturbing, to say the very least. What Western governments are working in the area to stop the violence? And that sort of ties in with another one a bit further, which says, what should the UK government be doing, and global leaders as a whole, to stop this happening?
Well, the UK is the pen holder on Sudan in the UN Security Council. And when there was a call for the arms, the accusation of arms being supplied to the RSF from the UAE, a very well-founded accusation. I mean, our sources have told us countless times that arms have been coming in. There are planes, like Flight Tracker, has shown numerous flights from Abu Dhabi to Chad, and sources on the ground in those border posts have told us that they're seeing these weapons cross through. So very well-founded allegations. When the UK was put in a position to bring these up, The Guardian reported that there were sort of closed-door meetings, and then the UK pulled out of bringing that forward in the UN Security Council meeting. So the pressure and you can see the ties are really preventing actual issues being brought to the table.
So the British government had knowledge of these arms being funneled into this civil war?
Yeah, UK MPs had put out a statement just before the Security Council meeting naming the UAE, that the UAE needs to stop backing and arming the RSF.
And effectively, His Majesty's government kind of gave diplomatic cover for that? Is that the allegation?
That's the allegation. The allegation was that after a series of meetings, it got brushed under the carpet and it was never brought up in the meeting. And I will also say that the UAE was an observer in the peace talks that were held in Geneva recently. US-led peace talks. So Western powers are providing cover for the UAE as a key ally, both the UK and the US, in the sense of this is a key driver of the war. The UAE's partnership with the RSF that did not start in this war. The RSF fought for the UAE and Saudi in Yemen. I've seen footage of their troops being trained by Emirati commanders on the ground in Yemen in 2018, 2019. So those ties are very deep. In terms of Western countries, I mean, we're a former colony. Sudan is a former British colony. And British colonization, I mean, the way that they distributed land in Darfur was predicated on tribalization. They decided that there are Arab settlers, nomads, and non-Arab African natives. They created this model. There are anthropologists who are in awe of how they managed to create a completely new anthropological landscape. And so now we're seeing the fallout of that. So there is like a historic...
Not the only place Britain did that in.
Yeah, divide and conquer.
Yeah.
But there's a historic responsibility for Britain to intervene, because even now, having to explain that there are Arab and non-Arab tribes, a lot of people are confused. They're like, they just look Sudanese,
Yeah.
But those divisions have been well sowed.
And there's the colonial legacy. There's a very murky realpolitik going on as well. And then you've got the distraction of this war in Gaza and Ukraine, of course. Simply Malik is saying here, are various terrorist factions around the world taking advantage of the world's attention being focused on Israel, Gaza and Russia, Ukraine? I suppose, you can apply the same question to our Western governments taking advantage of that. I mean, would they be more invested in trying to resolve this, do you think, if we didn't have these two massive distractions going on elsewhere?
It makes me think of like African dictators holding elections around Christmas. You know that people are going to be preoccupied and you can just hide in the darkness and do what you want. This is what it feels like. It feels like they know that the attention of audiences is split. The humanitarian funding is split. I mean, a lot more people donated to Ukraine. A lot more people are invested in Ukraine. I think I don't want to be as cynical as to think that they are like pleased by this, but I think they get away with their inaction.
It's convenient, I suppose.
Extremely convenient.
And yet Sudan is such an important country. It's a huge country.
Yeah.
It has a massive diaspora. So, there are millions of Sudanese around the world who obviously massively invested in this war and trying to end it for personal reasons. And it is a very consequential nation, isn't it? We should remind people, because I think it's kind of been, it made a massive impact at the time, but it's kind of fallen off the radar to some extent in terms of the news, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, even if you're not a humanitarian, you should care about this because it's got a long coastline on the Red Sea. We saw this summer where, instability in the Red Sea affects people's daily lives, right? It's a corridor country. Migrants have been moving through Sudan to go to Egypt and Libya to get to Europe for decades. A lot of Sudanese migrants who don't want to leave Sudan, who would rather stay in their homes, on their farms, in their land, are now being forced to look for options abroad at a time where the West is essentially telling them, we don't want migration, we don't want migrants. It's this catch-22. You're not intervening effectively, and yet you're upset when the migrants kind of end up on your coast. Another thing is terrorism in the Sahel. Sudan was a key counterterrorism partner with the US, even during Bashir's era, even during he was a sanctioned man, yet they still needed to rely on him to combat rising jihadism. And now we're seeing in the Western Sahel, in Mali, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, the West is being pushed out and jihadism is on the rise. Then you've got Sudan, which is just like arms proliferation to the max. You've got a war with all of these bad actors who are going to get access to gold mines, uranium deposits, and 800 kilometers of Red Sea coast. It is going to be explosive, and it is explosive right now.
And talk us through, going back to the report that we're highlighting and the reason we're having this discussion, what was it like for you doing this report and for you following this devastating tragedy that began with such hope in this uprising, this kind of revolution, overthrowing a tyrant and a dictator? It must be harrowing for you, particularly because of your personal ties with the country. But just, talk us through how hard it is to operate there and how hard it is for you emotionally, I suppose, dealing with all this.
It's crazy how it used to feel like the emotional impact was really intense. It's now a physical impact. Like it is now, I get to Chad and within days, my stomach, like I've got cramps, I've got like my immune system is compromised. And it's interesting because seeing how my parents' health has deteriorated, seeing how my friends' parents have deteriorated over the last year and a half, it is taking a physical toll on our community. Like it is sickening. And going to Chad 3 times and seeing it just get worse and worse. And this time, so we usually go to the border with West Darfur. This time we went to the border with North Darfur. It's where our report is, and it's also where the battles are raging for it's the last stand basically for Darfur. If the army lose the garrison in Al Fashir, in the capital of North Darfur, the region's essentially cut off. It's now will be the RSF's territory completely. So being on that border and seeing people who had literally gone through militia checkpoints, flooding, waded through rivers. There was a woman who was heavily pregnant, gave birth the day that we arrived. We saw her the next day with her son, newborn, hadn't breastfed for 20 hours because she didn't have any breast milk. She'd just come from like a famine area. And realizing there's no end to this war in sight. There's no humanitarian funding to get food distribution to the people that need it. And Chad is being accused of funneling arms from the UAE into Sudan and is a key partner to Hemeti. And the worry is that these refugees are there's 630,000 at least. They're at the mercy of a country who is cozied up with the militia leader that forced them out of their home. And
this massacre that you've focused on, that's not a one-off, is it? That's one of many, many massacres that are happening and are likely to happen.
100%. That massacre is, I think, the blueprint for the massacres that came after it. It was very early on. The army garrison is accused of being compromised. We spoke to an army officer who said that the barracks had been sold, but we'd spoken to several security sources and people and loved ones of soldiers who were killed that day who said that the barracks had completely been sold to the RSF. And then in the months that followed, we've seen 4 out of 5 army garrisons in capitals in Darfur fall to the RSF. Similarly, abrupt withdrawal of army forces and people then just at the mercy of these hungry, violent militias afterwards.
Yeah, so what you've seen, this cold-blooded massacre, as a template, I suppose.
Yeah, it is.
That could happen again and in the future.
Yeah.
Certainly it's been repeated since 2023.
Yeah, exactly.
And the methods of genocide, if we can call it that, or certainly the methods they're carrying out are murder, massacre, rape.
Yeah.
I remember one guy in your report says, if they take your food, they take your belongings. If your daughter's pretty, they rape her.
Yeah.
Very matter of fact the way he relates that.
And the UN fact-finding mission that came out, report that came out recently, isolated rape and sexual slavery on the basis of ethnicity and gender as some of the crimes against humanity that the RSF is committing. It was always seen as like a weapon of war that they used in the 2003 genocide. They've been using it across the country, in central Sudan, in the capital Khartoum, across Sudan. It's now, I met women in Sudan in February, in Port Sudan, so kind of in the wartime capital, who said that they were arming up. They were learning they were getting military training and wanting to defend themselves because of the threat of rape and sexual violence, that they had seen so many of their family members get raped that they wanted to learn how to use a rifle and kill their attackers. And
amongst those who led the revolution, is there a sense of regret, do you think? Is there a sense of maybe we shouldn't have risen up against Bashir because what's come afterwards has been even worse?
It's crazy, Dom. I thought that would be the prevailing sentiment. I was worried that would be like this kind of hopeless, nostalgia. Not at all. I think there is a lot of despair. There's a sense of real pain that this is what we get for fighting for our country. We get trampled. But I think people would do it 100 times over, because the neighborhood resistance committees that organized protests and helped injured protesters and managed to kind of create that organization around the revolution, they're the ones who are running the community kitchens. They're the ones who are helping people. They're running emergency rooms, like makeshift hospital rooms, as hospitals are getting ransacked and looted and attacked and shelled by the RSF and being hit with airstrikes by the army. These guys are still on the ground. They're proving to us that the revolution was true and real, and that they will fight for their country at any cost. And the people they're fighting for are the civilians, not the military state.
So no sense of regret. But what we get from your reporting, not just today, but also over the last year or so, is there is a sense of betrayal, I think, isn't there? That people feel they've been just ignored, let down by the outside world.
100%. I think it's interesting because I was in school in Sudan when the genocide was happening in 2003. You wouldn't hear a word about it in Khartoum. It was downplayed. It was denied. It was like, because we were in the seat of power. Bashir was very much, running the country. Oil was still flowing in from the south. It was before the secession. And we heard about it from outside. We heard about it from international reporting. It became an unavoidable reality because the world was decrying it.
Right.
Now it's the opposite. People in the country are trying to tell the world, this is happening, help us. And everyone's just turning away. And it's so crazy to me to see it flipped and see, I think we can all kind of turn up our noses at celebrity activism, but it really did help. There are peacekeeping mechanisms, there were peace agreements, there was a United Nations, African Union peacekeeping mission. There was relative stability in Darfur for, I'd say, a period of around 15 years. But when Hemeti came into the capital in 2019, there was an uptick of ethnic violence.
So before we sort of wrap it up, what do you think the world needs to do? And hopefully, this report and others like it are going to sort of reignite interest in the plight of Sudan. One question here from Neville saying, what's the Prime Minister Keir Starmer said about this? What can he do and what can other world leaders do? Because they are very distracted by other conflicts, aren't they, at the moment?
I had a quick Google to see if Keir Starmer had said something on Sudan, and I'd missed it. And he hasn't said anything. He hasn't actually really paid any attention to Africa outside of counter-migration efforts and, pledging more aid to stop migrants from coming to Europe and the UK. And that's quite I would say, a cynical way to approach Western intervention, to stop migrants from coming to your doorstep, when actually it is bad for global security if Sudan continues to unravel the way that it is. And what I think helped and will help is pressure on the countries involved that are facilitating, funding, arming the RSF, pressure on host communities, Egypt, Chad, Ethiopia, who are housing, hundreds of thousands of refugees and are starting to treat them like an unwelcome guest. I think there needs to be a sense of care, monitoring, and understanding that it's actually not that complicated. It is violence against civilians that is unwarranted and shouldn't be accepted on a global stage.
We have the UN General Assembly coming up, the big sort of jamboree in New York coming up at the end of the month. All the world leaders converging on New York. Do you think this is going to come up? There's a lot on their plate, I suppose, but it's a hugely important conflict, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it will come up. I mean, I think the UN has very much shown that they want to put forward independent findings with the UN fact-finding mission. There's been a big push to get aid into Darfur through the Adre crossing, though I met truck drivers in North Darfur who said that they couldn't get through because of RSF checkpoints. I think there's been an effort, but there's a limitation of funds, and there's also a bureaucratic paralysis, I think, that is quite frustrating because they are still at the mercy of the people who run the territories, which is the RSF and the army. And bringing in a peacekeeping mission is not possible unless they kind of act above it, unless they kind of do what people want the UN to do, which is to kind of rise above the actors on the ground and intervene in a way that's neutral and effective.
And as is always said by the UN, when they're asked why are they not peacekeeping more, they have to have a peace to keep. There's no peace to keep at the moment. So there's no real hope of negotiated settlement to this war at the moment, is there? Well,
the UN has been targeted. Like, their warehouses have been targeted, their staff have been attacked, MSF staff, like INGOs are also dealing with, it's just unruly violence. It's really hard. But I think the line about peace to keep, I think it creates a threshold that's very hard to meet. I think at the end of the day, there needs to be a way to intervene that neutralizes at least some sort of humanitarian corridor where people can move in and out, because the people that are trapped in some of these besieged cities are going to die either from armed violence or starvation.
It doesn't help if Britain, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, is being accused of kind of conniving with arms funneling into this particular war.
Exactly. I think the kind of ties between the UAE, the US, the UK is going to continue to show its face. And the problem is that the way it's showing up is making Sudanese people and people invested in this war and wanting this war to end very cynical about Western intervention and thinking that, the UAE will always kind of pull rank on the UK and the US when it comes to its support of the RSF.
Right, a huge amount of hand-wringing and concern about the war in Ukraine, and not the same with the war in Sudan. And Abdullah here says, why wouldn't the UN intervene? I mean, one answer to that, of course, is the UN is not an organisation. It's a collection of member states, and you need the political will, don't you, amongst those member states to make something happen.
And the UAE is an influential kind of UN member, and it has that kind of influence over the UK and the US, who are on the Security Council. Before we wrap up, we should say that we've approached the RSF and the individuals named to comment on these allegations. While the RSF has not replied to Sky News directly, it has told the Washington Post, our partners in the investigation, this: the ethnic dimensions of the conflict had been overblown and exploited to manipulate the Western media, and people in Kutum from different tribes are now living together peacefully, overseen by an RSF commander from the Africa Fur tribe. What do you make of that? It's inaccurate. The people that we're speaking to are fleeing again. Some of the people that we worked with had to leave town before the report because the RSF are terrorizing people. I got a message the other day about a woman who just got chucked out of her house because she had a nice roof and militia leaders wanted to just use her home as a base. So the idea that Kutum is peaceful right now is absolutely inaccurate. It's false. Yes, so thank you very much again for your very courageous and very powerful reporting from Sudan, not just on this report, but over the last year or so. And keep it up. Thank you. Thanks, Tom. Good to talk to you. Thanks, really good.